When we hear the words Silk Road, our minds often go back to the ancient trade routes that stretch thousands of miles across deserts and mountains. For centuries, it connected China to Europe, moving silk, spices, gold, and ideas between civilizations. But in the 21st century, the name was reborn with a very different meaning. This time, it wasn't a dusty road lined with caravans. It was hidden behind encrypted doors on the internet. And instead of silk and spices, it became a place where people traded in drugs, weapons, fake IDs, and digital secrets. This new Silk Road was not a romantic journey. It was a descent into the digital underworld. The Silk Road of the dark web appeared in 2011, like a ghost town suddenly springing to life. To the average internet user, it was invisible. You couldn't stumble upon it by accident. To enter, you needed Tor, special software that masked your location and identity. Once inside, what you saw looked shockingly normal. A clean interface, categories for different products, seller profiles, star ratings, and customer reviews. If you didn't look closely, you might have thought you were browsing eBay or Amazon. But the items listed were far from ordinary. Ecstasy, LSD, heroin, forged passports, hacking tools, even guides for committing crimes, all organized neatly, each with a price tag and fast delivery options. Behind this hidden empire was a young man named Ross Ulbricht. On the surface, Ross was an ordinary American with a sharp mind and a passion for libertarian philosophy. He believed deeply in free markets, in a world where people could buy and sell without government interference. He dreamed of creating a digital utopia where liberty reigned and control vanished. To bring that dream to life, he created an online marketplace where anything could be sold, as long as it didn't involve violence or child exploitation. He called himself the Dread Pirate Roberts, after the mysterious character in the movie The Princess Bride, whose identity was passed from one person to another to maintain a legend. Ross thought the name would protect him, would give him a mask to hide behind. He believed he could outsmart the system. At first, the Silk Road was small, just a handful of listings, a few sellers, a few curious buyers. But word spread quickly. Forums whispered about a hidden site where you could buy drugs like ordering a pizza, where everything arrived in the mail, wrapped innocently in envelopes and packages. Within months, the Silk Road exploded in size. Thousands of sellers joined. Tens of thousands of customers arrived. At its peak, it had over 100,000 users and millions of dollars flowing through it. The secret weapon of the Silk Road was Bitcoin. At that time, Bitcoin was still a strange, experimental currency. Most of the world didn't understand it, and few believed it would last. But for the Silk Road, Bitcoin was perfect. It was decentralized, beyond banks, and difficult to trace. Every deal, every payment, every exchange ran through Bitcoin wallets. Ross set up an entire financial system inside his dark web empire, allowing transactions to flow silently and invisibly, far beyond the eyes of regulators and police. For the buyers, the experience felt surreal. With a few clicks, they could order cocaine, heroin, or prescription pills and have them delivered right to their doors. Sellers built reputations, competing for trust with reviews just like legitimate businesses. Some even offered discounts and customer service. It was the commercialization of crime, packaged neatly for the digital age. But behind the illusion of freedom was destruction. Stories began to emerge of teenagers overdosing on drugs ordered from the Silk Road. Families who had no idea where the substances had come from suddenly found themselves facing tragedy. While Ross claimed the Silk Road was a safe alternative to street crime, the reality was darker. No matter how clean the interface looked, the consequences were real and deadly. Law enforcement around the world began to take notice. Agencies in the United States, Europe, and beyond realized that they were facing something new, something unlike any drug cartel they had ever fought. This wasn't run by gangsters with guns on the streets. It was run by coders, sellers, and anonymous buyers scattered across the globe. How do you take down a marketplace that doesn't exist in any physical place, that hides behind layers of encryption, and that uses money designed to avoid detection. It became one of the most complex digital manhunts in modern history. Ross, meanwhile, believed he was untouchable. He sat behind his laptop, running his empire from coffee shops, libraries, and apartments, often blending into the crowd as if he were just another student working on a project. He carefully maintained his Dread Pirate Roberts persona, issuing philosophical statements on forums, arguing that the Silk Road was about freedom, not crime. He painted himself as a digital revolutionary, a fighter against government control. But as the site grew, so did the chaos. Ross began to face blackmail, threats from users, and infiltration attempts. What started as an experiment in liberty was turning into a monster he could barely control. By 2013, the Silk Road had become the Amazon of the underworld. Reports estimated that over $1 billion worth of goods had been traded through the site. The FBI, DEA, IRS, and Homeland Security had all joined forces to hunt it down. What they discovered was not just a website, but a sprawling ecosystem. Vendors using fake shipping labels, couriers unknowingly delivering illegal packages, and digital laundering services designed to wash dirty Bitcoin into clean money. Every time investigators thought they had found a lead, it disappeared into the maze of encryption. But somewhere, hidden in plain sight, Ross Ulbricht was making mistakes. And it was only a matter of time before his empire of shadows would be exposed to the light. This is just the beginning of the dark story of the Silk Road. In the next part, we'll step deeper inside the machine, into the mechanics of how it really worked, the cat-and-mouse game with law enforcement, and the cracks that began to show in the empire that thought it could never be caught. The Silk Road wasn't just a website. It was a living, breathing organism, growing bigger and more complex every day. To understand how dangerous it became, you have to picture what was happening behind the screen. Imagine thousands of vendors scattered across the world, some professionals in the drug trade, others ordinary people experimenting with crime for the first time. They carefully packaged cocaine in vacuum-sealed bags, hid pills inside envelopes disguised as birthday cards, or tucked LSD blotters into ordinary magazines. These packages, small and unremarkable, were handed to postal workers who had no idea they were delivering the fuel of an online criminal empire. On the Silk Road, trust was the currency as much as Bitcoin. Sellers built reputations with detailed profiles, ratings, and feedback from customers. Buyers compared reviews before placing orders, just as if they were shopping on Amazon. A vendor with 5 stars became a trusted brand, and many operated with surprising professionalism. Some even offered refunds, loyalty discounts, and customer support. One vendor famously advertised stealth packaging and guaranteed delivery within days. It was crime polished to look like business, and Ross Ulbricht, the man behind it all, sat at the top of this invisible empire like a silent king. As the Dread Pirate Roberts, he wasn't just the administrator, he was the philosopher of the Silk Road. He wrote essays on freedom, liberty, and the dangers of government control. He told users that they were part of a revolution, that they were creating a society where people could transact without fear. Many believed him. Others simply enjoyed the fact that they could buy anything they wanted without leaving their homes. But the reality was far darker than Ross's dream. With each passing month, the site grew more dangerous. Hard drugs flowed more freely. Some vendors began selling counterfeit passports and driver's licenses, giving criminals new identities. Hacking tools were listed, allowing anyone with money to break into systems. Manuals for committing fraud appeared in the catalogue. The Silk Road was no longer just a marketplace for drugs. It was becoming a global black market for crime itself. Law enforcement knew they had to act, but the challenge was unlike anything they had faced before. Infiltrating the Silk Road was like chasing shadows. Every user was hidden behind Tor, every transaction buried in Bitcoin. Investigators from the FBI, DEA, IRS, and Homeland Security formed a task force, pooling resources and intelligence. They set up fake accounts, bought drugs to trace shipments, and followed the digital footprints of Bitcoin wallets. Slowly, Piece by piece, they began to map the hidden world. Meanwhile, Ross was making mistakes. For all his careful planning, he couldn't erase his humanity. Early in the Silk Road's life, he had posted about the site on public forums under his real name, asking questions about Tor and Bitcoin. Those breadcrumbs, left casually, would later become critical evidence. He also carried his laptop everywhere, running the site from coffee shops and public libraries. He believed blending into the crowd kept him safe. But in reality, it made him vulnerable. As the site grew, Ross became paranoid. The weight of running an empire of crime pressed down on him. He feared betrayal. He feared undercover agents. At times, he even considered ordering violence against people he believed threatened him. Although no actual murders were ever proven, evidence later suggested Ross had paid hitmen, who turned out to be undercover agents, to silence his enemies. The man who once preached peace and liberty was slowly being consumed by the darkness of his own creation. Inside the Silk Road, cracks were beginning to show. Vendors scammed buyers. Buyers cheated sellers. Some users lost Bitcoin when dishonest players disappeared overnight. Others fell victim to addiction, overdosing on substances that arrived in plain packages. The media began reporting on deaths linked to Silk Road drugs. Governments called it a threat to public safety. The noose was tightening. But even as law enforcement closed in, Ross was still convinced he was ahead of them. He upgraded the site's security, improved encryption, and created complex systems to launder Bitcoin. He even dreamed of building Silk Road 2.0 and expanding beyond drugs into every corner of commerce. He imagined a global underground economy outside the reach of any government. In his mind, he wasn't just running a website. He was building history. Yet the net was closing. Investigators were watching closely. Each package intercepted at customs, each Bitcoin traced, each careless forum post added to the puzzle. Ross didn't know it, but the FBI was already narrowing its sights on him. His digital mask was slipping. By 2013, the Silk Road had become the stuff of legend. Journalists called it the Amazon of illegal drugs. Experts estimated more than $1.2 billion worth of goods had been sold through it. Thousands of people, from college students to organized crime groups, used the site daily. But for Ross Ulbricht, the world he built was starting to collapse around him. The cat-and-mouse game between the dread pirate Roberts and law enforcement was entering its final stage. What Ross didn't know was that the walls were already closing in, and soon, the man who believed he was untouchable would be caught in the very web he had spun. This is where the story turns. In the next part, we'll follow the dramatic downfall of Ross Ulbricht, the FBI's takedown of the Silk Road, and the shocking aftermath of one of the most notorious criminal cases of the digital age. Ross Ulbricht had built the most infamous black market in internet history. For 2 years, he had played a dangerous game, staying one step ahead of law enforcement, convinced that his philosophy of absolute freedom could survive in the shadows of the digital world. But the bigger the Silk Road grew, the more attention it drew. And behind the curtain of the dark web, powerful agencies were quietly closing in. The FBI, DEA, IRS, and Homeland Security had formed a joint task force. They worked across time zones, sharing clues like puzzle pieces scattered on a table. Every intercepted package, every Bitcoin transaction, every slip of information from Ross himself became part of a larger map. They knew the dread pirate Roberts wasn't a ghost. He was a man somewhere, running this empire from an ordinary computer. All they had to do was find him. Ross believed he was safe. He lived quietly in San Francisco, blending into the crowd of young tech workers. He worked from coffee shops, libraries, and rented rooms, his laptop always within reach. He carried encrypted drives, multiple identities, and passwords that could lock out even the most skilled hacker. But paranoia began to shape his life. He worried constantly about betrayal. He knew the stakes. If caught, he faced life in prison. To protect himself, Ross created layers of secrecy. He used VPNs, fake email accounts, encrypted chats. He trusted almost no one. And yet, he was human. he made mistakes. Years earlier, before the Silk Road became famous, Ross had asked technical questions on public forums about how to use Tor and Bitcoin together. At the time, it seemed harmless. But when investigators began searching old internet posts for connections to the Silk Road, they found Ross's name linked to these discussions. The threads didn't prove he was the mastermind, but they raised suspicion. The FBI also traced servers used by the Silk Road. In Iceland, investigators discovered that the site's main servers were hosted there, hidden behind multiple layers of protection. Through technical analysis, they managed to find leaks in the way the Silk Road handled connections. Tiny details in the server's code revealed clues that ultimately linked back to Ross. It was like following faint footprints in a storm, but the footprints were there. Meanwhile, Ross's paranoia grew darker. Evidence later showed that he had allegedly arranged violent acts against people he believed threatened the Silk Road. On one occasion, he thought a former employee was blackmailing him. Messages found later suggested he tried to hire a hitman, paying tens of thousands of dollars in Bitcoin to make the problem disappear. In reality, the so-called hitmen were undercover agents, and the supposed targets were never harmed. But the fact that Ross considered such actions revealed how far he had strayed from his original vision of liberty and peace. The trial lasted just a few weeks, but it gripped the world. Journalists packed the courtroom. Outside, supporters waved signs calling for Ross Ulbricht's freedom, arguing the punishment wouldn't fit the crime. Inside, the jury took only a few hours to deliver a verdict. Guilty on all 7 counts, including conspiracy to commit money laundering, computer hacking, and drug trafficking. In May 2015, Ross was sentenced to 2 life terms without parole, plus 40 years. The severity shocked many. Violent criminals often got less. But the judge wanted to send a message. The Silk Road wasn't just a website. It was a revolution in digital crime, and its impact had been deadly. Parents of overdose victims testified their children had bought drugs through the site. The sentence reflected not just Ross's actions, but a fear of what the internet could become if left unchecked. But even behind bars, Ross's story wasn't over. Within weeks, Silk Road 2.0 emerged. It was quickly shut down, but the cycle had begun. Other dark web markets rose and fell. Alphabay, Hansa, Dream Market. The idea had taken root. The dark web was here to stay. The legacy of the Silk Road is complex. It revealed the power of anonymity, encryption, and digital currencies to create a global black market without borders. It forced governments to confront a new kind of crime, one driven by code, not guns. But it also sparked debates about freedom, privacy, and punishment. Some still argue Ross wasn't just punished for his crimes, but for challenging the system. Still, the human cost is undeniable. Lives were lost, addictions grew, criminal networks evolved. The Silk Road became both a warning and a prophecy, showing what happens when technology outpaces law and when idealism collides with reality. Today, Ross Ulbricht sits in a federal prison. He'll likely never walk free again. His dream of a decentralized utopia ended in handcuffs, in a quiet library. The Silk Road is gone, but its shadow lingers. The dark web thrives, Bitcoin is mainstream, and new platforms rise every year. The battle between freedom and control, privacy and law, is far from over. The Silk Road wasn't just a marketplace, it was a mirror, reflecting the dangers of unchecked desire in a world without limits. And it left us with a question we still haven't answered. When technology grants total freedom, what do we do with it? If you found this story compelling, subscribe to the channel. More mysteries, more crimes, and more hidden worlds await. This was the dark side of the Silk Road, just one chapter in the long, shadowy history of the web's underworld.